Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Romy Drucker, and I'm the Director of Education at the Walton Family Foundation. And I'm excited to be here today to welcome all of you to Unlocking the Future toward a new reform agenda for K-12. And I want to thank Opportunity America for hosting us today and for being a critical partner in developing the work and ideas that will be showcased in today's conversation. As so many of you know, young people in America today need our support and partnership more than ever before. The pandemic erased 2 decades of progress in literacy and math, and those academic challenges and learning challenges are compounded by a significant well-being crisis as young people express that they are dealing with anxiety and stress and depression at higher levels than ever before. What we know is that the kids who have been most significantly impacted are the ones that have been most affected in the long run by long-standing systemic inequities. Today's conversation is about a path forward. And the good thing is that young people are expressing hope that there is a path forward, that education can be reimagined and redesigned in ways that can better engage them, better support them, better prepare them for their futures, and make them feel like they're part of their community. And I'm very excited to listen in today as we have a robust conversation of ideas and inspiration about how we can work together to do that. One of the other themes that I hope you take away from today is the importance of redefining collaboration in this moment. Everyone you're going to hear from on today's webinar is brilliant in their own right. They have original ideas and thoughts and long-standing experiences in the work of educational change. And every one of them could talk to you for the next hour as individuals about ideas that they hold and that their organizations are driving forward. But the exciting thing about today's session is that these brilliant individuals have come together to collaborate, to rethink, to combine ways of solving problems. And that's exciting because this is a moment that calls for creativity and ingenuity. And I want to express my deepest gratitude to all the participants in today's session. I know that it wasn't straightforward and it took compromises and challenging one another to think differently. But I feel like the agenda that you have put together is bold and ambitious. And I know on the part of the Walton Family Foundation is going to be an important blueprint to guide us all forward. So with that, I want to say thank you again for joining, and I hope you learned something today. And I'm excited to turn over the program to John Bailey, who will be serving as an MC in today's session. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Romy. And I just want to acknowledge just the amazing support that the Walton Family Foundation gave this project, to Romy in particular. It is not easy leaning in to some of these really hard issues right now, but the Walton Family Foundation and Romy in particular is so passionate about helping to facilitate important conversations and often difficult conversations where there's disagreement, and not having less disagreement, but better disagreement. And that was very much true with this group. And it's the only way we're going to move forward and have a reimagined education system is by having those tables set, having amazing catalytic funders like the Walton Family Foundation, and then also amazing leaders that we're going to hear from today. And I want to bring on our first panel, which is an amazing group of leaders. We have Francis Massano from New School Ventures Fund. We have Robin Lake from the Center on Reinventing Public Education, and also the incredible Kate Rodriguez from the National Parent Union. Before we get to them, I just want to sort of set the table. That I encourage everyone, go and read the essays. The essays are pretty accessible. This is not a tome of 80-page documents. These are pretty accessible, 5 to 10 pages per essay, teeing up ideas, getting a contours of what a path might look like going forward. But you could see some areas of consensus emerging across the essays. You see a lot of support for more parent involvement, You see a lot of discomfort with the way accountability is being done now in different ways that accountability might be done, including new measures of assessment. Francis is going to talk about that too going forward. Rethinking the role of teachers, but also other adults in the community. And also this renewed emphasis on career education, something that, again, Walton has been leading on, a lot of other partners in the field, and also something we're hearing from the employers and public leaders across the country. And so, Francis, let's bring you first because I think you like help frame this moment for us. Why is there a need to put in the hard work right now to build a new consensus? Why is that important right now? Oh, and Francis, we can't hear, or at least, there you go. I think we can hear you now, Francis.
Can you hear me now? Okay, so I'm going to
There
do
we
some
go.
changes to reposition my camera as we do
Oh,
this.
good.
But sorry about that. We're all learning how to roll with technical challenges. And what I was saying was that it's good to be here with you, John, and good to be here in this conversation with you, Robin and Carrie. And so, to your question, the reason why we need to build a new consensus in education right now is because students across the country are depending on us. You know, we've all just been impacted by the world's worst pandemic in 100 years. And what it's done is that it's exacerbated and amplified the longstanding inequities, both in education, healthcare, and the economy. And as Romy started to share in her introductions, we're seeing the impact of that, which has been student achievement levels dropping to levels we haven't seen in 20 years in math and reading, the increase in mental health crises. We've also seen college enrollment decline, especially enrollments directly from high school. And this is happening at a time when in education, we're also seeing an increase in teacher vacancies, especially in hard to fill roles like math and special education. And we also know that while all students have been impacted, students of color and low income students have been disproportionately impacted. They were less likely to have connectivity and devices necessary for distance learning, and were more likely to experience financial distress, food insecurity, and the loss of loved ones, while also grappling with a racial reckoning that we've all been going through in our society. And so when I think about all of those reasons, we must act and we must drive change in education, because we know also that education wasn't delivering on its promise before the pandemic. And now, even coming into this conversation, I had people sending me links to kind of new articles on what's happening with chat gpt and artificial intelligence. Like, our world is rapidly changing right now, and changing at an incredibly fast pace. And so when we think about the introduction of new technologies, we think about growing inequality, the political polarization and culture wars that we're experiencing. Like, we need to make sure that our young people are equipped to meet the challenges of the future so that they can help design and create a better world for all of us. And so what all of that means is that we can't go back to the way education was, because it wasn't good enough. And so we must come together as an education sector to meet this challenge. So we need a clear vision, we need aligned leadership, and we need courage and optimism to make sure that we redesign our system as it is.
That's great. That's a great segue into Robin's essay because what you said, not going back to normal, because normal wasn't working for many kids, but also some of the most disadvantaged and marginalized populations. Robin, I mean, what did COVID reveal about our education system, and what were some of the challenges that sort of led to the fracturing and the fraying of this old reform coalition?
Yeah, thanks, John, and Francis and Carrie. Just a note of acknowledgement that all four of us worked together in the course of these last 3 years pretty intensively, and it's great to have an opportunity to take a pause, debrief a little bit. I feel like we're all suffering from a little PTSD, so I think this reflection and trying to pull out the lessons is really, really essential. In terms of what it revealed so much, right? And so we're all trying to sort of get down to the core principles here and what's most important for moving forward. Not to beat anybody up, but to say, like, what was it about the system that made it created a situation, the situation that Francis described, which I will say, we brought a lot of data to the table through our State of the American Student report and things. So, this kind of obvious that things are very, very bad, right? I think that what's important to really reflect on right now is it didn't have to be this way. It really didn't, and we shouldn't be shocked that it is this way. So, any of us who have been working in reform for a long time, none of us knew it would go on so long, but could have predicted this and should have predicted this. And I think there are a few things that I look to in terms of describing what went wrong that should kind of tell us what we need to stop doing going forward. And the first is that clearly the system was built for sameness, built for the status quo, and importantly, hardwired for inequality, right? And so the inequalities that we saw reveal themselves are baked into the system. We saw it revealed most obviously in terms of access to technology, access to live instruction, just, being able to just talk with your teacher, engage with your teacher. If you're falling behind, have contact with your teacher was completely unequal. We saw that in our data, more advantaged schools were twice as likely to provide live instruction to students as less advantaged, less economically advantaged schools. And these are just things that were tip of the iceberg. We should be concerned about them. We should be outraged about them. We should also be outraged that kids, have never had equal access to high quality instruction and such. So, the ways that inequality revealed themselves and the reasons have to be something that we take a very, very hard look at. We also have to take a look at the fact that individual needs were not met during the pandemic. And it was actually outrageous to me that in the name of equity, everybody had to be treated the same way. And so therefore, individual needs just couldn't be met. If we couldn't do things all the same way, we couldn't do them at all. And that meant that students with disabilities, for example, couldn't get access to buildings for far too long, because if they came in, other kids had to come in, it just went on and on. I think also the fact that politics, not science, drove so many decisions, whether it was closure decisions, reopening decisions, the lack of attention to the science of instruction played out right before us in those ways. But parents also got this unique opportunity to look into what was being taught to their kids. And those of you who have listened to the podcast Sold a Story will remember that so many parents during the pandemic took a look at what was going on in their classrooms and were outraged about how their kids were being taught and started asking fundamental questions. And I think the last big principle here is that students were bored out of their minds when they weren't in the social environment of school, when they weren't forced to sit in classrooms. They showed us that learning was not relevant to them. They didn't see the value proposition of high school. It wasn't connected to career. And so all this stuff, came to pass. And yes, it certainly affected the most vulnerable students. But I think what's also really important to note is that all students across race, income lines were seeing this stuff play out, and a lot of us said, welcome to the party, right? So yeah, and so there we are. And I think the last thing I want to say, John, is that we can go on and on, right, about the problems that were revealed, but I think that the less obvious dynamic that we have to come to grips with as reform people, whether we call ourselves reformers or not, who's against who's for the status quo right now, right, is that the old reform ideas, the old reform coalitions also didn't show up very well. That they showed that they also were ossified. The case for reform was not great. The old accountability systems, not great. The college for all mantras kind of rang hollow. And there wasn't really an organized coalition to act with students when the kids needed us the most. So we have work to do.
Yeah, great point. I mean, not only have those coalitions not necessarily showed up as much during the pandemic, but I think we're hearing that now too, a little bit in the recovery as the health emergency goes away and the learning emergency, the scope of that just becomes even more apparent. Robin, you mentioned in your comments that parents had this glimpse as to what was going on in schools because they could look over their kid's shoulder, and we've just seen a lot of parents who are frustrated, they're angry, and no better essay in our collection than Carrie, who gave this perspective of why parents are frustrated right now. And Carrie, maybe I could just bring you into the conversation, and you gave this powerful sort of essay about giving voice to why parents are frustrated. And maybe you could just share a little bit about what is it that educators and policymakers right now don't understand about modern families and also their frustration in this moment?
Well, you really don't have to tell us that, public education has never worked, because we are right now living out the consequences of our own experiences in the public education system. So I think often what we fail to truly understand is that, the parents of today were the failed students, the students who were underserved and were never able to equitably access opportunity of the last generation. And so this is not a surprise to us. Like, we have direct lived experience with all of this. So for some of us who have been, in the fight for education justice since before the pandemic, it was kind of an interesting moment to watch, some of, the folks who have fought us tooth and nail because they had this inherent trust in the system, because the system has always served them well. And we're talking about wealthy white parents who live in the suburbs, parents who have had that beautiful experience of the public education system, suddenly watching all of this situation playing out in their own living rooms and saying, oh my God, I think we have underestimated the amount of damage and the loss in terms of that relationship, that trust, that inherent trust that a lot of parents and families had in America's public education system, and how that has damaged things, and why you are seeing toothpaste that you can't put back in the tube. Like, parents have seen what is really going on in classrooms, what is really going on with their kids. And, we can't kind of go back to the old days of saying, well, I'm just going to trust that the system is going to take care of this. The system has not earned that trust from us. So, what I tried to do in this essay is to bring a new lens and a new perspective on the idea of parents being involved, parent engagement, whatever you want to call it. So often, there are these platitudes that come out. Oh, parents are the first teachers. Parents are so important. We care about you. But unfortunately, as stakeholders, we're not really treated that way. We're often dismissed, and kind of pushed off to the side and dismissed as anecdote, and not really treated as critical stakeholders with a vested interest in the success of these systems, because they have our children. And so, understanding, it's kind of like giving folks human being lessons, like, you're asking us as students who were underserved in a last generation to now step back into a system which, we were traumatized by through that underserving. We actually have very difficult circumstances, one more round on that, cycle of poverty. Like, that's what it is. And now we're expected to just hand over our children and hope that you'll do better this time, when not a lot has changed. And we can see that. So, sometimes not even the teachers, not even the educators have changed. There's no reason to trust that anything has changed if we have literally changed nothing. So in this moment where we have had to become co-facilitators of education, literally in our living rooms, and we're not content with just being pat on the head and saying, don't worry about it, we've got it, or, your kids aren't really meant for that. You're seeing this energy. You've seen this shift where parents and families are stepping up and wanting to be a critical part of the recovery and what reimagining education looks like. And just to kind of underscore what Robin was saying in terms of the failures that we've seen in this movement, where we're supposed to be innovators and ready for this moment, we had an unprecedented opportunity where we had an unprecedented disruption of the American public education system. And we've done polling for years now, where we've been able to demonstrate to the field that by 2-to-1 margins, the American public, American families want us to reimagine education. This is the moment. We've got it. We've got the energy. We've got the public momentum, everything. Yet there's been like this failure to launch here, and this failure to really capitalize on that moment. I think the window's closing. It's still there, but this is the moment to really transform. What does that mean? What is it going to look like? And I think what you're also saying too is that parents and families have some real ideas in terms of what that should look like and how we could transform things. It's about whether or not we've got the energy and the urgency to actually do that for our kids.
Well, let's go there. That's a great sort of prompt to just say, not just looking back about what's been wrong, but more about going forward and what should we get right? How do we take advantage of the opportunity that Carrie just so articulately laid out, and then that parents are demanding, giving us permission to do. And I just want to go with each of the panelists. Robin, let's start with you. Like, what do you think are the issues that a new coalition could be built around?
Yeah, well, I think it's nice to turn to this because it's a little bit of light in the midst of the doom and gloom. And, I think that the thing that the pandemic revealed that we haven't talked about yet is there's a better way, right? And we saw it play out in the pods and hubs and micro schools when parents and students and, importantly, educators were given the freedom to craft what they thought was right and good. Some really important things emerged from that. And we saw that some students really prospered outside of the traditional system when they had more agency over their learning, more control over their schedules. Community stepped up to provide mentorship that was just latent. It was waiting to be tapped into, and there it was. Relationships really mattered. These are all really important reminders about the potential for a more joyful and sane set of learning opportunities, and ones that capture the assets that are just sitting out there waiting. And so I think that the types of things that we need to be thinking about are highly individualized school designs. And I'm not just talking about personalized learning as people have talked about it in the past, but radically personalized learning. What would it mean to take every student's pathway incredibly seriously and change the way that we think about schooling? So not everything needs to be provided within the school, but schools and CMOs and districts think of themselves as managers of a portfolio of student learning opportunities instead of providing all of that. So that's one area where we need to push hard. And the other area is around who educates and how. Reimagining the teacher workforce. One of the lessons that we learned from looking at the pods movement was, parents loved them because they were so individualized and great, and relationships and all. But educators were crazy for them because it reminded them why they got into teaching in the first place. And now we have to think about how to do that within the traditional school system, of course, but we have to start with the idea that the one teacher, 30 kid classroom model is dumb. It's just dumb, it's ineffective, it's impossible. Reimagine that. And then we need to think about career relevant learning, not just in terms of programs, but reimagining the high school in every American high school so it's relevant and pathway oriented. Happier learning spaces. And just at the system level, I think we have to get to more nimbleness and resiliency. And there we get to the old reform kind of tenets around, what does accountability look like? What does financing look like? Some of the essays in this collection really get to those hows and whys and reimagine them so that they can be oriented around more permeability, more joy, and more resiliency going forward.
More joy. We need more joy. I know we're running a little bit over, but I don't want to cut the conversation too short. But maybe I just want to bring in Frances and Carrie. Carrie, just path forward. What are some quick bullet points about what are the best ways for policymakers and school leaders to earn back the trust from parents? So it's not a platitude, but that it's an authentic engagement and involvement with parents. What would be the two pieces of advice for a path forward there?
So there's two things, right? Number one is understanding what a modern American family looks like. And it is not this 1940s, 1950s model of mom stays home, dad goes to work. Like, it's insane. The modern American family has changed dramatically, and the education system's view of what that looks like is just so distorted and weird. You have working families, you have single parents, you have, grandparents raising grandchildren, the LGBTQIA families, families that are in recovery, families who are impacted by incarceration. Like, we've got to expand our minds around what families are and how to engage them, and then operate as such. Number two is this shoebox model, this real factory model of education is not what American families are looking for. You've got to show us you care about our kids. 86% of American families want individualized education plans for every child in America. We want education and context. We want a pathway for our child so that they can access economic mobility. We want to know what we can expect when our kids leave K through 12 education, and are they prepared so they can access opportunity? That's why we do this. Can we get back to that? And can parents and students, frankly, drive that process so we can decide what the pathway looks like? That would be transformational.
Great. Love it. And then Francis, you had this amazing chapter really challenging us to come up with a new way of thinking about student success. And maybe you could just touch a little bit on how do we take advantage of this moment and the changes coming out of the pandemic, but also the world for what a new measure of student success should look like, a new system of student success. Oh, and Francis, I think you're muted again.
So I agree with much of what Robin and Carrie said about what it's going to take to get us to a reimagined system. So a focus on individual learning plans, a focus on new models, thinking about how we change the educator workforce, come up with new human capital solutions for change. But I think all of that needs to be grounded in this broader definition of success. And I think we are still we don't have the consensus on what we want to be true for our young people. Like, what is the promise of education? And what I believe is that we are preparing our young people to thrive as full humans in our society. And so what that means is that we need to focus on ensuring that young people have access to a strong academic foundation, that they're also developing social emotional competencies that they need to succeed in life. And I know social emotional learning has become a dirty word, but at the end of the day, what it means is that young people are developing the habits, the mindsets, and the skills they need to be successful in life. They're building strong relationships with the adults and their peers. They are developing critical thinking skills. They believe that their learning will grow with their efforts, right? So how are we supporting young people in that while also helping them to get a deeper understanding of who they are, developing an integrated identity in school, right? So that they have belonging, they understand their powers, and have a plan to actually realize their goals. So I know we're short on time, so I'll leave it there. I saw you try to interject, but it's all outlined in the essay.
It's all like, read these essays. These essays are great. They're provocative, and they give us a little bit of path forward. So I just want to thank Francis. I'm going to thank Carrie. I want to thank Robin, both for your contributions and for your time today too. And then I'm going to welcome back on our virtual stage Tamar.
Hello, John.
Hi.
Now, I'm also muted, apparently. Can you hear me?
Oh, no, I can hear you.
Okay,
yeah,
good.
You sound great.
Okay. Well, you and I are going to swap hats now. So I'm going to be the moderator, and you're going to be in the hot seat. And I'm going to be a tough on-time moderator. But before we get to that, I just want to I wanted to say one quick point about the collection, because I want to thank the Walton Family Foundation, add to the thanks to the Walton Family Foundation, and note that Walton had the wisdom way back before the pandemic to see the problem that Robin put her finger on, that there was really no working coalition for reform. Things were wrong. We didn't know what to do about it, and there was no way for right and left to come together and fix things. And Walton saw this 3 years ago, 4 years ago, more. And the purpose of this group, of this project, was to bring people together and see if we could find our way to a new consensus. And let's be honest, we didn't get that far. we did not get to a new consensus. That's an important point to note about this collection. This is not a manifesto. This is not everyone singing on from the same sheet of music. These are 12 quite different essays. But, there's a beauty to that because it's such a richness of ideas in these essays. So, you'll go to them and you'll dip in and out, and they're so different and so interesting. Different kinds of voices. Some are personal and angry, and then some are data-filled and clinical and analytic. Some are come from a left perspective, and some come from a more conservative-leaning perspective. And this variety also gives us a real richness of ideas. So I just want to encourage everyone. I'm very proud of the collection we're put forward, and I want to encourage everyone to read it. Not because of anything of mine, but because of the people, the 12 authors. But so now we're coming to John Bailey, and I'm wearing my moderator hat. And John, it was so hard to pick who to put on this stage because there's so many good ideas in the collection. But you're among the ideas that are some of the most exciting. So I'm going to tease the audience a little bit. We're going to come to quite a new idea for rethinking accountability from you. But let's start before we get to your new idea. Let's set the stage a little bit. For those who just came out of a cave, what does accountability in K through 12 education mean, and what was wrong with it? What has been wrong with it up to through the pandemic?
Yeah, I think I tried to give a little bit of a very brief history of the accountability, which accountability systems have always involved some measures, often test results, that then get put into a system that provides transparency, often in the form of school report cards. And then because of federal law, but also state laws too, require using that information in which to categorize schools as high performing and low performing, and then to target interventions and assistance to those low performing schools and turn them away. I mean, that's a overly simplistic, but that's sort of the accountability system arc for ever since No Child Left Behind. And I think there's a little bit of some of what I was trying to tease up is that there's a bit of some frustration with that. There's a bit of over promising and under delivering that we haven't seen some of the radical turning around schools that I think many of us thought these systems would produce. And also, I would say we've tinkered with that accountability system more with the way that we identify if a school is high performing or low performing. And what we've struggled with mightily under any type of the regimen is how to turn around schools, regardless of how we identify them. What do we do to take a low performing school and turn it to be high performing for those students? That has bedeviled every administration and governors as well as school leaders. And so I was trying to put a little bit of a flashlight on that.
That's great. Really great setup for your idea that's coming. But just to be clear and play a little devil's advocate, you're not for throwing out everything about the old accountability system, right? You are for changing it in quite a dramatic way, but you do have language that suggests that you want to keep the best of the old. Is that not correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I think we keep parts of it. I would sort of say what I'm trying to tee up is changing the incentive systems a little bit away from sort of clubbing schools and creating an incentive system that rewards performance and rewards improvement on a bunch of the different sort of measures that Francis just talked about against the new measures of student success.
Okay, well, I see in your suggestions for reform, I see really 4 ideas, 2 that are kind of you've taken from other people that are about changing the timing of how the tests go and changing the reporting of how the tests are read out to given out to parents and teachers and children. But you have 2 much bigger ideas. And your 2 big ideas I really think go together. Let's start with the first one, redefining the metrics. Let's start there. Rethinking the metrics. What do you really need? As you suggest, let's listen to employers and listen to universities and rethink what the metrics are.
Yeah, I should say, again, my idea, I don't think it's new in education. It's not new in the realm of public policy that I borrowed from the way that we do, if you will, accountability in healthcare. And so what has been the bipartisan consensus for accountability in healthcare for almost the same amount of time as we've had No Child Left Behind is 2 things. One, identifying measures of value and quality. And so the way in healthcare they do this, they have panels of doctors and nurses and experts that put together different types of measures of quality. Because if you think about it, the outcome measure for quality for LASIK surgery is very different than the outcome quality for life-saving heart surgery. And if you think about it, that's very similar to what we have in education, that we've been too narrow, maybe on some of the academic indicators. And then as Francis pointed out, as many people in our cohort did too, as well, that there are all these other new measures, whether it's social emotional learning. And so by identifying all that, it gives us a menu by which to then start incenting or adding incentive payments on top of the way that they do in healthcare.
So again, just to tease out what that means, right now you get more money if you're a failing school, correct? And you get less money if you're a good school. So you're gonna turn that around with your new system? How's that going to
I
work?
want to say yeah, I think again, the way they do it in healthcare is that they switch from a fee for service where you're just paying for the quantity of services. If you think about it, that's almost exactly what we do in K-12 education. We pay for more things, more tutoring, more after school, more summer school. And we don't create any sort of incentive for good after school, good tutoring, things that actually deliver value for kids and for families. In healthcare, that payment system is switching. Where now, if value is measured by those new quality indicators are achieved, you get paid a little bit more. And so I think there's all sorts of ways for us to provide base funding. There's ways for us to provide catalytic turnaround funding, but then also you can start creating financial incentives so that as schools are improving, as they're serving some of these, as Carrie was saying, ignored students for way too long, and help them turn around, schools can actually earn more in their Title I and other sort of federal funds. So that would be sort of the way that I would sort of think about it. But it's like switching the incentive system to not just do more things, but to do better things in a demonstrated set of values for kids.
But your qualification that you just offered is important. You're not going to, if you don't improve, we're not taking all your money away. There's going to be base funding and turnaround funding as well.
Yeah. I mean, no, this would
Yeah.
not be taking money away. And also in healthcare, we don't take money away necessarily. There's all sorts of ways to do it. You could take the school improvement grant money and use that as the incentive payments. You could freeze Title I and just do cost of living adjustments and then make bonus payments on top of that. There's all sorts of mechanisms of which to do this. So you're not stripping the resources away from schools to empower themselves to turn around. On the other hand, we've been flooding schools with money. And, as I think the last panel just showed, it hasn't been delivering nearly the results in just the baseline before the pandemic. And I think there's a lot of skepticism right now that even with the $190 billion that's out there, we're going to see nearly the type of catalytic improvement that we need over the next decade here.
Okay, well, we could go on talking about this for a long time, but it's just a little taste for the listeners and for the audience of some of the really interesting original ideas in the paper. John, one last lightning round question for you before we go. Is this going to appeal to left and right? Like, does this have any chance? Like, is this politically? Where's this going?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, again, healthcare is not a perfect analog, but there's a lot of similarities in education. And here, value-based payments were started. The mechanisms for that were started in the Bush administration. They were carried through and augmented in the Obama administration, Trump administration, the Biden administration. So it shows you that at least there's a bipartisan interest in that framework over there, that maybe that can serve as a bit of a roadmap for how we could do it here. And also as a way of threading the needle on how do we balance academic indicators with SEL indicators, with parent surveys and student surveys. This gives kind of a roadmap to bring all those things in and start using them in a way that creates incentives for schools to deliver value.
Okay, you heard this idea here first. Taking off the moderator hat and giving it back to you, John, and you're up with the next session. Thank you so much.
All right. No, thank you. And it is a great privilege to bring onto our virtual stage Denise Fort, who heads up the Education Trust. And for those of you in the education sector, we know how important the Education Trust has been as a civil rights voice that helped usher in No Child Left Behind, as well as so many of the important reforms that happened under USSA. And Denise has a great essay that does something that's rare, I think, for those of us who are in public policy, those of us, especially in DC. We often we're crowd away in conference rooms and think tank rooms, and we write reports. And Denise starts with this amazing sort of reflection, telling a very personal story about how often we as policymakers, education leaders, we have this great ideas, They look great on paper. They sound great at conferences. And then you go out and you meet people on the ground. And so, Denise, maybe I could just invite you to share what that personal story was that you used to tee up some of the really great examples in your essay.
Thanks, John, and thanks for having me today. There's nothing that can be truer than when you finally realize the moment where you just maybe didn't get it right. And this comes from a story when I was actually working on a law dealing with educating students who are homeless and giving them access to higher education. And I can remember that day so clearly because here we were thinking that we had gotten all the different pieces right. We had made sure they had access to college. We made sure that they were covered under the FAFSA, made sure that they had financial aid where necessary, housing, tuition, books. But in having a conversation with one of the students, we came to realize we missed something particularly important because for this student, it would be the very first time that they spent any time away from their family, not in a shelter. And waking up or actually going to sleep without a family member was really quite traumatic for that young person. So we had done everything that we thought, but we really missed a real critical piece. And I think that really relayed to me how important it was to hear from the voices who are impacted when you're making decisions like that. Without that real world sort of understanding, without having the data that's necessary, and without hearing from the voices, you really aren't making the policy impact that you wanted to make. And so we carry that with us at the Education Trust every day, really thinking about how we're going to engage families and students in the work that they need to achieve.
Denise, you had several great lines that really stuck with me reading your essay. One is that the future of K-12 education hinges on how well we work with students and families. The promise of school improvement, what we were just talking about, depends on bringing communities to the table to drive solutions. So maybe you could just reflect a little bit, like how do we do that? What does meaningful engagement look like? How can we better listen to parents as part of this?
Two really good examples, and that line really did stick with me as well, because if we are really about the future of K-12 education, who else should we be talking to but the students and families that are interacting with the system every day? And particularly with the pandemic, when we saw so many day-to-day shifts of what was going on, we were missing a lot of students. The students who could go to school, who no longer could go to school, were missing meals, lack of high-speed internet. Tons of things were coming to us on a regular basis, but without real engagement from families and communities who were feeling the pains of the pandemic every day, we really didn't understand how well we needed to serve them. And probably one of the better examples we have was an example in Massachusetts where they actually did meet the moment and had a campaign that ensured that they could actually find a time to listen to students and families and their experiences. Working with the local news station, they actually did a series of webinars where they lifted up the voices of families and what they were going through the pandemic, as well as doing focus groups of families, oversampling for African American and Latino families to really understand what were the day-to-day realities that they were going through. And through that, we understood that many of these families didn't have any access to the decision making that was going on at the time in their local school districts. And that's what they were asking for. They wanted to know how decisions were being made about the $190 billion that was being sent out to schools and how those dollars were actually impacting the schools. And just by these webinars and seeing these focus groups, we could understand what kind of impact those dollars could have if families and students were allowed access to decision making. So we actually developed a toolkit with our partners in Massachusetts that was easily understandable, translated into Spanish, and use the data so that students and families would have a way to access any level of decision making and really understand how those COVID dollars were being spent in their schools. And it was really one of the first times that we heard from families saying they finally understand a way that they could ask these questions and get good answers about what was going on in their lives that was related to the school system.
You mentioned Massachusetts, but you gave a couple other examples too. I think in Maryland and California. Was there one other example that just sort of struck you, inspired you about how this could be done in a good way? Good way.
Well, probably the story in Maryland was really enlightening because for the first time it was really locally led, and we could see that. And they also talked about the infrastructure that was necessary to keep the local engagement going on. The Black and Brown Coalition, which exists in Maryland, was founded by two local leaders who, after looking at the data and understanding what was going on in their school system, realized that many Black and Latino students weren't having equitable access to the services that they deserved. And so through data and through working with the school system, they were able to convene a large group of parents and families to help them understand what was necessary in budgeting and what would be necessary with the data in order to make sure those services were provided. The infrastructure allowed them to create newsletters and actually have access to a broader network of other community partners that they could connect with and ensure that at their convenings they would be able to invite as many people as possible, because it really was making sure that you had a large group there who could understand what was going on and then advocate for themselves. I think that was a really, really interesting example of community engagement.
That's great. That's great. Well, Denise, thank you. Thank you. Everyone read the essay. Go to the EdTrust website so you can see this toolkit. And it's going to be an important tool in the toolbox as we build this coalition and do this work going forward. And then what I'm going to do is now turn over the stage to Ian Rowe and to Darrell Bradford for the last part of our conversation.
We're bringing up the rear, Ian. How you doing?
I'm doing great, man. It's great to see you, Darrell, and it's such an honor to participate. Good to see you, man.
All right, cool. So I got a couple questions to you. I will hold you to your pithy remarks of earlier. We're going to keep it sharp. So you too have a compelling essay in this journal called "Distance to 100: An Alternative to Racial Achievement Gaps." So why don't you give the people on the stream a quick overview of what that essay is about?
Yep, thank you, and thanks to the Walton Foundation and Opportunity America to be part of this. Yeah, you know, the basic premise is that if you look at the mission statement of virtually any education reform organization, the call to close the racial achievement gap is like right at the center of that mission, and it makes sense. It's something that we all, on the surface, would want to achieve. The big problem is that the effort to close the racial achievement gap hasn't worked. So in the paper, I cite the work of Eric Hanishek and Peterson, a bunch of other economists, who demonstrated that the academic achievement gap between rich and poor has not budged for 50 years. And similarly, the racial achievement gap has barely narrowed over that same period of time of 50 years. And so in the piece, I offer what I believe is an empowering alternative that I call Distance to 100 for everybody, which presents a way to understand the actual factors that truly drive academic performance of individual students that transcend the typical identity group characteristics like race or gender or class.
So you offer this this distance to 100 approach, and you sort of just got into it. You said it would recognize that every educator's goal is to prepare all students for success instead of focusing exclusively on racial achievement gaps. Can you tease that out a little bit more?
Yeah, when we constantly focus on the black-white achievement gap, essentially that establishes Black student performance as inferior to white student performance. And we're always looking at white student performance as the standard that we should all be seeking to achieve. But the reality is the majority of white kids have, in the entire history of the nation's report card, there has never been a year at fourth grade, 12th grade, that a majority of white students are reading at NAEP proficiency levels. So the sad irony is if we actually did close the black-white achievement gap, all that we would have achieved is universal mediocrity for all students, right? So essentially, the black-white achievement gap, it obscures far more than it reveals. Because the tendency is that when we look at black-white, we're talking, the tendency is if you look at black-white achievement gaps or racial achievement gaps, you're going to assume that the causality related to those gaps is racial in nature, that it's systemic racism, and often crowding out all other factors, as well as it also obscures the national literacy crisis for all of our kids. Only 37% of all kids in our country are reading at NAEP proficiency levels. And so we have to expand our aperture on how we measure individual student performance and not always assume that group dynamics are the driving characteristic.
So we heard that from Mr. Bailey that accountability is a thing that is sort of in flux right now. We heard from Francis about multiple sort of definitions of success. All measurement can create sort of perverse incentives. Like how would your distance to 100 approach elide such perverse incentives or be more resilient to them?
Yeah, it's absolutely a valid concern. I mean, at the state level, virtually every state has manipulated the standard for how they define proficiency in order to gain access to maybe federal funds or other mechanisms that prop up scores. That certainly happened in New York multiple times where, reduce the proficiency rate and suddenly more kids are reading, right? So the reason I like NAEP as the standard is that it is still it is held firm for 30 plus years, and it's a national standard. So because proving your ability to read in Massachusetts should be the same as proving your ability to read in California. So a lot of my distance to 100 is anchored around NAEP as being the standard to reduce the more local incentives to change proficiency. And the reason I think that distance to 100 can be powerful is if you look, typically when you look at scores, you see these bar charts of here are the percentage of black kids versus the percentage of white kids versus the percentage of Asian kids that are, and always being, that are at proficiency or not, and always being treated as blocks. Well, imagine if rather than looking at student data by identity group classifications, instead you had more scatter plot distributions by individual. So imagine what you would typically see in that kind of presentation at the top tier of the distribution platform. You'd see that there were black kids, white kids, Asian kids, Hispanic kids in the top part of the scatter plot. And in the bottom portion of the scatter plot, you'd see black kids, white kids, Hispanic kids, Asian kids not performing well. It would force us to analyze, well, what are the common characteristics that are driving the success of the top students? We obsess over failure. We always say poor kids of color that are not doing well. There are lots of poor kids of color that are doing great. Why? What are the factors? So it would force us to look at things outside of race, like the structure and stability of the families in which kids are being raised, whether or not the number of hours spent studying, whether or not kids in the top tier, the difference is that they have access to school choice and educational freedom. Essentially, by changing the view of how we look at student performance data would dramatically change our theories of causality and therefore our theories of action.
Ian, you did a great job keeping it pithy. I urge everyone to read your essay, Distance to 100, along with the other ones in the non-tome tome. Thanks for the time, man, and I will turn it over to John Bailey.
Thanks, man.
I know we're at the top of the hour. That was great. We're gonna just take some Q&A, some questions, and I'll toss them out to the panelists here. We let's see. We have one question that came in. What do we need to do to build public will for these reimagined efforts, given the political culture wars that continue to rage? So, great question. Maybe Darrell, I'll toss it over to you first. But what do you think can be done? I know this is something that you and 50 Can have had to navigate as your coalition and state networks. But how do we do that? How do we hold that space?
Yeah, I mean, I guess two quick things. One is that you have to listen to the polling or read the polling and realize that though political figures are wildly polarized, the American people are not. Like regular folks want answers. And so, like, I embrace that. We embrace that. We think that's really important. And then the second thing is you just got to have policy in place to let people try. This new thing doesn't come into existence without people getting the opportunity to experience it and internalize it and then decide they want to advocate for it. So we always say pilot before you pilot, try it small and let it take root and go from there.
Yeah. I mean, Francis, maybe can I bring you in? And because New Schools has had this history of having to constantly sort of push the frontier of new models, new systems, new way of thinking. And so, some of this is different, some of this is not at this moment. But how are you as a leader at New Schools thinking about, at a time when there's a lot of polarization in the country, how do we have conversations around the issues we just talked about for the last hour and drive some sort of consensus forward?
Yeah, I mean, the focus that we have at New Schools is we're really following the leads of our innovators and trying to see how we can provide them with the support that they need to do their best work. And so what's happening is that they're coming to us and talking about the challenges that they're facing on their ground. They're seeking support. And what they're really trying to figure out is how can they still advance their vision for change despite the political environment that's around them. And I mean, the truth is, it's the power of bringing coalitions like this together where we can actually connect to what are the realities on the ground to say, like, how do we move from the ideas that we have here to what's actually being experienced. And so, Denise, your comments really resonated with me because I think having the ideas are one thing, but if it's not actually meeting the realities of what school leaders are facing, teachers are facing, and students are facing, we're actually not going to drive change. And so what I'm thinking about is like, how do we kind of bring all these ideas together, connect to those who are on the ground so that we have a much better connection between policy and implementation, what practitioners are experiencing. And so I think that requires us to do a lot more listening, a lot more testing, a lot more refining, so we can actually see what can take root.
That's great. We have one other question. As you described, the system is in need of real innovation and customization. What is the role of school choice in helping to advance that innovation so that all families can choose the right education for their unique child? Maybe Robin, I'm going to start with you, and then we'll go to Ian for that one.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the case for choice is stronger than ever. I mean, how can you have individualization without choices and options? I think we need to broaden our aperture on how we think about choice. I think we need to think about it from lots and lots of different reform ideas and perspectives, including within districts. And so, talked about, the idea of pods. Well, Mesa Public Schools in Arizona has created a little pod within a school. These things are possible, and we've got to think about how to create those options all over the place and take lessons from the past around choice and think about how to help people manage those options more effectively. So, the benefits don't accrue to the most well supported. So education navigators and things like that are really needed to think about how to manage more unbundling and rebundling.
That's great. Ian?
Yeah, well, I just launched, Vertex Partnership Academies and International Baccalaureate High School in District 12 in the Bronx. In that district, if you were a ninth grader in 2015, 4 years later, only 7% of kids graduated from high school ready for college, meaning that they started ninth grade and either dropped out or they actually did earn their high school diploma, but still couldn't do math nor reading without remediation if they were go to college. This has been going on for generations in this district, and yet in New York City, there's a cap on charter schools. The union actually sued us from opening our school, but we beat the union. But there's literally a cap. So those, if you live in District 12, those are the schools, the 7% schools that you are sentenced to have to attend. So school choice is fundamental. We have to mobilize parents to demand that they have the same kind of school choice options that middle and upper class families have enjoyed for generations across the country.
That's great. Okay, we are almost at the top of the hour, but I just want Carrie. I want to Carrie. Then one great last thought from Denise that I'm going to prompt. But Carrie, what is one thing that's giving you hope right now in terms of parent engagement?
I think that we had a moment where we thought parents might get angry and excited based on what they saw in living rooms, and then they just kind of go back to sleep. And parents are not going back to sleep. It's extraordinary to watch and how these things are blossoming, and watching, parents in Minnesota write landmark legislation, the READ Act, which is going to transform literacy in that state. And, same thing happening in New York State around math and exploring the science of math and how we can improve the outcomes for kids in New York. I mean, these are all things that are driven by parents and families who didn't consider themselves experts or were intimidated by the process, that have just, stuck to it and can't come together. And they're coming up not just mad, and they're not just coming up in a big movement, but they're actually coming up with some really incredible solutions and demanding change. And I think, that's part of what we've been missing, and that's not going away.
Awesome. Okay, the final thought I want, because I think this is a good thought and a metaphor for us to leave with. But Denise, in your essay, you end with the metaphor of the folding chair. And maybe I could just have you, what is that metaphor, and how can that be a good charge to us as we're going out into our communities? Oh, Denise, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. As Shirley Chisholm said, if you can't get a seat at the table, then sometimes you need to bring your own folding chair. And I think that is very much the case of many families across this country who just want a folding chair at the table in order to be involved in decision making and be involved in the well-being of their students.
Perfect. I love that metaphor. We should be setting tables with lots of chairs for people, but if there's not a chair, bring a folding chair. I just want to thank this incredible group of leaders: Frances, Carrie, Denise, Robin, Darrell, and Ian. And also I want to thank Tamar, who had the task of corralling this unruly motley crew, and she did an amazing job. And I just want to thank all of you for taking valuable time out of your busy day to join us today. And we hope these essays spark some thinking that you can take to help us rebuild better the type of education that will deliver better for parents and for students. And with that, we'll sign off. So thank you so much.